how do you choose the right pair? Like you talked a little bit, I think, about costs and automations and so on. But like I guess the left hand side of the pair, like the collateral token, is somewhat easy. You know what the collateral token you probably want to use is, unless you've maybe got many. But yeah, how do you choose the right pair to borrow with, at least initially?
Yeah, so I think there are a few factors that everyone has to go through in their head, which hopefully we can make it really like easy for people to just think about these questions. So I'd say the first one you kind of hit the nail on the head already, which is what asset do you want to borrow against? Like what assets do you trust basically to borrow and to deposit? Um, so on the collateral side, you have to really determine like what do you deem to be quote unquote fungible, which is just a fancy way of saying you think they're the same. So for me, I really think about wrap staked ETH, rocket pool ETH, and raw ETH itself as kind of very similar things. I'm happy to borrow against any of those. And then similarly, and I think maybe even more importantly, you need to really consider what do you consider like safe and trustworthy to borrow. So if in the case of a stable coin, for me, I used to really only care. I used to really only feel comfortable borrowing DAI. But now as things have evolved, the market has evolved and stuff like that, I'm really happy to borrow DAI. I'm happy to borrow USDC. And maybe the 2016, 2017 self would be like yelling at me, but I'm actually probably happy to borrow USDT today as well, which is maybe a bit shocking, but it's true. And so,
Yeah, it was always going to go. It's still here.
it's still
It's
here.
not looking like it's
Yeah,
going to go anywhere. Touch wood.
exactly,
Um,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. So yeah, I think if it goes somewhere, DeFi probably has a lot bigger problems today. If that
yeah,
happens. So yeah, happy to do that. So that's the first question. What am I happy to deposit? What am I happy to borrow? Then when it comes to borrow positions, you got to think about your LTV. And this is a question we get a lot because you'll often see similar pairs with different LTVs. And all this really means is it's how much you will have available to borrow. And higher LTVs will always mean that if you borrow the same amount of something with a lower LTV, you'll always have a lower liquidation price. So maybe that's a bit complicated, but basically, to give an example, if you have something with an 80 LTV and another thing with a 65 LTV, if you borrow, say, 100,000 USDC from both, the one with the higher LTV will always give you a lower liquidation price. And that comes at a cost because the protocol generally is bearing that sort of extra risk, and it's going to come at a cost to you, which is in the borrow rate, which is the next thing you need to consider, and that's the cost of the borrow rate, so the cost of capital. So you need to think, how much do I want to spend on this? On Summer, that's another thing that makes Summer great, is that you can easily see when you open the position how much you're expected to pay per year. So that's another thing you need to really take into account is the cost to borrow. And lastly, especially for borrow positions, related to that borrow rate is how much those rates are going to fluctuate. Can you think about them as being really predictable and consistent, or should you think about them as being really variable and going to go all over the place depending on the market movements? Maybe that's something you want to touch on in terms of the different protocols and how they how users should think about the different protocols when it comes to rates changing and stuff like that.
yeah. I mean, I think we can go deeper into the protocols later, or even maybe or maybe on a different call. It's kind of
Okay.
looking how far in we're already in at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of obvious ones, right? Where you've got Maker and Spark. If you're borrowing DAI, are obviously like they're not fixed rates, but they're kind of they're not constantly updating. They're not real time rate adjustments on a rate curve or anything like that. They're generally set by external teams that adjust them at most every week, more often than not every couple of weeks or months. At times, kind of depends what's happening in the markets more generally as well. But then you compare that to the likes of Aave, Morpho, and even Arjuna as well, that's on Summer at the moment, like or those protocols on Summer at the moment. They move depending on utilization. Arjuna's a little bit slower. The rate can only update once every 12 hours, so you don't get if you get a huge withdrawal on the lending side, for example, it isn't instantly going to change the rate, or if it's gone beyond 12 hours since the last one, then it's only going to change by most of 10% of the current rate. But yeah, Aave and Morpho and stuff in particular, they can fluctuate around quite quickly, and you've got to be a little bit careful, I think, at times when you're looking at the rate and trying to understand if that rate is just like I think we've seen it before, especially with USDC, when USDC was doing some like funky things and so on, probably about a year ago or so. But like the rate would jump to like 17%, and you'd be looking at thinking, wow, 17%, that is high. And then a couple of hours later, it was back down to like 8% or 9%, simply because maybe a big lender had just withdrawn like USDC from the lending side on Aave, and moved it elsewhere, or like wanted to maybe turn it into ETH or WBTC or something like that. So yeah, you've got to sometimes take a little bit of time and context to say, okay, what is the rates doing? Like, what is the more like blended rate over like the last 24 hours or 7 days or something, to give you a good indication of exactly what that is. But yeah, I think we could talk a lot more about protocols, maybe on a different call as well, because I think it would take us probably about an hour or so just to talk about the differences and comparisons between the different protocols. I think today definitely. It's more about am I trying to borrow? Am I trying to multiply? Am I trying to earn? Or those things? What is it I want to do, and what product is best for me in that sense? Totally. And maybe making an assumption of like all protocols are equal in some ways, even though every protocol will tell you that they're better than all the others. They all have their pros and cons and trade-offs and so on.
Definitely.
But yeah, I think that's great, and I think that's an amazing summary of Borrow, though. And if I can